The Scarecrow. Who would put $100 scarf on a scarecrow? Darleen Norris exclaimed. She brushed her blonde hair away from her big blue eyes. That's crazy. Scott Grant shook his head. Really crazy, he said. He took off his glasses and wiped them on his shirt. Then he put them back on. I don't see how a scarf can cost $100. It's cashmere, Melanie Lynn said. She kept her dark eyes on the Scarecrow's neck. It's the softest wool in the world. Darleen, Scott and Melanie all lived on Maple Street. They'd been walking to school together since kindergarten, and now they were in the 7th grade. This morning, though, they were running late. But they had to check out a scarecrow that had appeared out of nowhere. The straw man stood in the front yard of the house next to Darleen's, the old Swofford place. Mr. Swofford died 4 years before. Nobody had lived in his house since. The paint was peeling off. Loose shutters banged in the wind. The yard was a mess of weeds, but now, in the middle of the weeds, stood a scarecrow. It stared back at them with sad, painted eyes on a straw-filled pillow. The red mouth was turned down in a sad, ugly sneer. On his head, he wore a tomato red baseball cap. He had on a black and white plaid flannel shirt, black jeans and white baseball sneakers. He wore a black jacket with its arms sticking straight out. The end of the arms was a pair of blue gloves, and wrapped around his spindly straw neck was the yellow scarf. It's the same scarf, Melanie was saying. I'm positive. She turned to Darleen. You saw it too, remember? When you went to the mall with me to get my new contacts? Darleen nodded. It looks the same, but nothing, Melanie interrupted. It's definitely the same. I about passed out when I saw the price tag. But why would anybody put $100 scarf on a scarecrow? Darleen asked again. It's too strange. Know what else is strange? Scott asked. That baseball cap. It's exactly like my cousin Eddie's. All red, no team emblem. What's so strange about that? Darleen asked. It's strange, Scott said, because I've been looking all over for a baseball cap just like it. The three stared at the scarecrow in silence for a moment. The clothes are great, Darleen said at last, but something about this scarecrow is creepy. Yeah, definitely, Melanie agreed. I mean, what's the scarecrow doing on Maple Street? Darleen asked. Halloween is only 2 days away, Melanie offered. Some kids must have just put him here for Halloween. Darleen sighed. Halloween is so boring. It's so boring and childish. I'm not even going to have a costume this year. That's what you keep saying, Scott replied. You just keep talking about how boring Halloween is. You're going to totally spoil it for Melanie and me. We'd better go, Melanie said. Mr. Costin said he'd keep us after school if we were late again. Wait, Darleen cried. She gasped. His gloves! What? Melanie asked. What about them? They're the ones in the window of Leatherworld, Darleen exclaimed. Her heart began to beat rapidly. I've been dying to get those gloves. Remember, I told you about them. Darleen studied the gloves carefully. Same bright shade of blue. Same soft leather, same silver snaps on the cuffs. They were exactly like the ones at Leatherworld. Exactly. This is strange, Melanie said. He's wearing stuff all three of us want. It's weird, Darleen agreed. She wondered if Melanie felt like taking the scarecrow's scarf, or if Scott was thinking of grabbing the baseball cap. She was definitely thinking about taking the gloves. She'd never stolen anything in her life, but stealing from a scarecrow, that wasn't really stealing, was it? She felt a strong urge to slip her hands inside that soft blue leather. Yikes, Melanie cried suddenly. It's almost 8:30. Oh no, Darleen moaned. If we're late again, Mr. Costin is going to kill us. Come on, Scott cried. They ran the whole way to school. Psst, Scott, Darleen whispered that afternoon. No talking, Darleen, Mr. Costin cut in. Sorry, Darleen murmured. She glanced over at the desk where Scott sat. She mouthed the words, "Where's Melanie?" Scott shrugged. Weird, thought Darleen. Really weird. They had been late that morning. Mr. Costin gave them detention. He told the three of them to come to his classroom for an hour after school, but only Scott and Darleen showed up. Mr. Costin handed them answer sheets and they began checking math papers for him. Darleen graded paper after paper, but the whole time her mind whirled with questions. Where had the Scarecrow come from? Why was he wearing things that she and Melanie and Scott wanted? And where was Melanie anyway? Darleen didn't have a clue. The hour finally ended. Darleen ran to her locker. Then she met Scott in the usual place on the front steps of the school. "I can't believe Melanie skipped out on detention," Darleen said. The two of them fell into step walking home. Scott shook his head. "I hope she has a good excuse," he said. "Or if she doesn't, Mr. Costin will keep her after school for a month." They crossed over to Maple Street. The old Swafford place was only 2 houses away now. Darleen's heart began to beat fast again. She hoped the Scarecrow was still there. He was. He stood in the weedy yard exactly as he had that morning, and yet Darleen thought he looked different somehow. Darleen admired his gloves again. They were so awesome. "Hey," Scott said suddenly, "his yellow scarf. It's gone." Of course, Darleen didn't see how she could have missed it. "Melanie will be sorry to hear this," she said. Scott shook his head. "How could someone rip off his scarf?" he said, "and leave that cool baseball cap?" "Or his gloves," Darleen added. Now she felt the urge again, the urge to take the gloves, but she felt a sudden chill. She knew she had to get away. She turned to Scott. "Hey, listen, I have to go," she said. "I have a ton of homework." "Hey, Darleen," came Melanie's voice. "Scott!" Darleen turned. Melanie was running across the street towards them. Darleen's blue eyes widened when she saw that Melanie was wearing a bright yellow scarf. "Mel?" Darleen said as she reached them. You took the scarf?" "I did," Melanie giggled and twirled like a fashion model. "I love it," she added. "It's so soft. I haven't taken it off since I got it, even inside the house. I'm sleeping in it tonight." "Is that why you cut detention?" Scott asked. Melanie bit her lip. "I know Mr. Costin is going to murder me, but I couldn't help it. I thought about the scarf all day in school." She turned to Darleen. "Did you think about the gloves?" "Yes," Darleen admitted. "All day." "I couldn't stop thinking about the baseball cap," Scott said. Melanie glanced from Scott to Darleen. "It's not like it's stealing or anything," she said. Her voice suddenly sounded hoarse. "Ow, sore throat," she croaked. She put a hand on the scarf and cleared her throat. Then she added, putting clothes on a scarecrow, that's practically an invitation for somebody to take them." "Really," Darleen agreed. "So," Melanie cleared her throat once more, "get the gloves, Darleen." "I don't know." Darleen stared at the pillow face, the sad eyes, the red mouth painted in such a sad, ugly sneer. She shuddered. Melanie turned to Scott. "Why don't you take the baseball cap?" she asked him. "Now?" Scott nervously pushed his glasses up on his nose. "Now," Melanie said. "Go on. You want it? Take it." It's getting so dark," Scott said. "I have to get home." With that, he ran across the street. "I have to go too," Darleen said quickly. "The scarf looks perfect on you, Mel." She waved. "See you tomorrow." Late that night, Darleen lay in bed. She couldn't fall asleep. Outside, the wind howled. The moon cast shadows of swaying tree limbs across her ceiling. She kept picturing kids in the yard next door. Kids stealing the Scarecrow's beautiful blue gloves. Darleen heard a banging noise outside. Somebody was after the gloves. Tossing back her quilt, Darleen sprinted to the window. She peered out. She couldn't see any kids, but maybe they were over by the house where she couldn't see them. Darleen dashed across her room, grabbing her robe on the way. She struggled into it as she ran down the stairs and out the front door. She raced barefoot down the porch steps, hardly feeling the cold. Wind whipped the trees above her head. Shutters banged against the old abandoned house. She ran to the rickety picket fence that separated her yard from Mr. Swafford's. The Scarecrow was alone in the yard. All alone. Darleen put a hand to her chest. Her heart was beating hard. She'd never wanted anything as much as she wanted those gloves. Darleen looked around. The street was deserted. The houses were dark. Now was her chance. All she had to do was run over to the Scarecrow, slip the gloves off his outstretched arms, put them on her own hands. Then they would be... Darleen! Startled, Darleen turned. On the porch stood her mother. What in the world are you doing out here? Her mother walked over to Darleen and led her inside. And on a school night too. She scolded as Darleen climbed the stairs to her room. Don't blame me if you have trouble getting up tomorrow. Darleen hardly slept that night. At dawn, she jumped out of bed. She ran to the window again, peering down. She saw that the Scarecrow still had on the gloves. She breathed a sigh of relief. As Darleen dressed for school, the phone rang. Darleen, said a raspy voice. It's me, Melanie. I've got the worst sore throat. I'm not going to school. Will you get my assignments? Sure, said Darleen. Darleen, Melanie croaked. Did you get the gloves? Not yet, Darleen said, but I will. After breakfast, Darleen met Scott in front of her house. She told him about Melanie's sore throat. Too bad, Scott said, but he didn't seem very worried. He licked his lips nervously. He fiddled with his glasses. I'm getting the baseball cap, he blurted out. Now? Darleen exclaimed. But we can't be late again. We won't be, Scott said. He dashed into Mr. Swafford's yard. He ran up to the Scarecrow and with a leap, grabbed the cap off its head. He zoomed out of the yard. There, he grinned as he put the cap on his head. He ran his hands along the red wool of the baseball cap. It's a perfect fit. Darleen thought that maybe she should follow Scott's example. Maybe she should run into the yard, grab the gloves. Go on, Scott coaxed her. Get the gloves. Yes, Darleen thought. She drew a breath. She glanced up at the Scarecrow then. She held back. Those sad eyes, that evil sneer. Something made her shrink back. Not now, she said. I'll get them after school. Darleen thought about the gloves the whole day. Even when her homeroom made plans for a Halloween party, all she thought about were those blue leather gloves. The school day ended at last. Darleen waited for Scott at the usual place on the front steps. She waited for 20 minutes, but Scott didn't show up. She was getting up to leave when she saw him walk out the door. He was wearing the red baseball cap. Scott, Darleen called. Where have you been? Scott stared at her, confused. What do you mean? He asked. Why didn't you meet me here? Darleen asked. He said, was I supposed to meet you? Darleen rolled her eyes. You meet me here every day, Scott, me and Melanie. What's wrong with you? Scott frowned. I don't think anything's wrong, he said slowly. I can't remember anything wrong. Is there? Stop it, Scott, Darleen snapped. Stop what? Stop acting so weird, Darleen said. Anyway, you're here now. Let's go. I want you to come with me to get the gloves. Okay, said Scott agreeably. He began walking beside Darleen. Are we going to the mall? He asked. Darleen narrowed her eyes at him. Why would we do that? Scott stopped walking. But you said, he looked at Darleen puzzled. Didn't you say you wanted to buy some gloves? No, Darleen yelled. I said I want to get the gloves. She added in a fierce whisper, the Scarecrow's blue leather gloves. Scott gazed at her blankly. Scott, Darleen said, are you okay? I think so, Scott answered. I just have a headache, a really bad headache. He adjusted the red cap on his head. Darleen felt bad for yelling at Scott, but he sure was acting strange. "Is that baseball cap too tight or something?" she asked. "No," Scott said quickly. "It's fine. I have to go." Darleen watched him walk across Maple Street. Then she walked to Melanie's house and rang the doorbell. Melanie's mum opened the door. "Hi, Mrs. Lynn," Darleen said. "I've brought Melanie's assignments. How's she feeling?" Mrs. Lynn shook her head. "Not great," she said. "She's lost her voice completely." Darleen shook her head. "Tell her I hope she's feeling better." Darleen crossed the street, stopping in front of the Swafford house. Nobody had taken the Scarecrow's gloves. It seemed too good to be true. Once more, Darleen felt her heart speed up. She stepped back. The gloves were great looking, but the Scarecrow was scary. Too scary. Darleen turned and hurried home. On Halloween morning, Darleen woke up and raced to the window. The sun was shining. The sky was cloudless and blue. Darleen thought it didn't seem much like Halloween, but at least the Scarecrow was still there, and so were his gloves. After breakfast, Darleen waited on her front porch for Scott. He didn't show up. Finally, she walked back inside and phoned him. Scott's mum picked up. "Oh, Darleen," Mrs. Grant sounded upset. "I should have called you, but Scott isn't going to school." "Does he have the flu?" Darleen asked. "No, he must have hit his head," Mrs. Grant told her. "He keeps complaining about a very bad headache, and he seems very forgetful. I'm worried it might be a concussion." "That's awful," Darleen said. "Poor Scott." She told Mrs. Grant that she'd pick up his assignments. Then she started off to school on her own. But in front of Mr. Swafford's yard, she stopped. Her heart began to flutter. She had to get those gloves. She had to. She couldn't sit through another day of school thinking about them. Darleen took a deep breath. She opened Mr. Swafford's rickety gate. She walked through the knee-high weeds. With every step, it became easier. Why on earth had she been afraid? She wasn't afraid now. She plucked off one glove, then the other. She slipped her hands into the gloves. There, they were on now. They were hers. And they felt great. She thought they looked great too, but it was hard to see them in the fading light. Very hard. She struggled to focus. She felt something scratchy brush her cheek. "Hey, let go," Darleen cried. "Let go of me. Stop. Let go." But the strong hands held on, gripped her tighter, tighter. Then everything faded to a deep blackness. When Darleen opened her eyes, Scott and Melanie were staring down at her. Darleen blinked several times. The trees and sky spun above her. She realized she was sprawled on her back on the grass. "We're sorry," Scott said before Darleen opened her mouth to speak. "Yeah, really sorry," Melanie added, leaning close. "We didn't mean for you to faint." "Huh? Faint? What?" Darleen slowly sat up. "It was a joke," Melanie told her. "We didn't think you'd really believe that the Scarecrow grabbed you." A joke? Darleen still felt dazed. She stared down at the gloves on her hands. "A joke? What are you two doing here?" Scott shook his head. "We knew you'd come for the gloves, so we hid behind the tree. Then I crept up behind the Scarecrow and grabbed you." "But Scott, your mum said you had a concussion, and Melanie, your throat, it was dry as straw, and you lost your voice." "All part of the joke," Melanie confessed. "Scott and I were faking." "Melanie and I put up the Scarecrow," Scott told Darleen, "and we dressed it. That's why everything fit us so well. We knew you wanted those gloves, so..." But why?" Darleen demanded. "Why did you go through all that trouble?" Scott shrugged. A grin spread over his face. "You said Halloween was boring, so we decided to give you an unboring Halloween this year," Melanie declared. "I can't believe it," Darleen said, shaking her head. "It's true," Melanie insisted. "Scott and I faked the whole thing. We did everything." "Then why is the Scarecrow smiling?" Darleen demanded. "Huh?" Scott and Melanie spun around to stare in shock at the Scarecrow's pillow face, which now stared blankly back at them with a wide, red grin across its face. Just kidding, guys. It's just me. Hey, look, if you are after more chills, thrills, and... Did I mention chills? Please subscribe to the Leftovers channel. I'll be doing a whole bunch more super spooky material, especially the Goosebumps book reading. I've tracked down every single one of those 10 tales to give you goosebumps, and I will be reading each story. So subscribe, hit that little bell icon so you can keep getting notified. You know how the system works. And yeah, tune in next time for some more Leftovers from the Leftover Culture Review.